Hello, Renew friends. Happy 2013. Hope you had a great holiday, great Christmas, and all of that. Today, I'd like to give the final response to Bart Ehrman's essay, What Do We Really Know About Jesus in Newsweek magazine. I've given, I think, 7 of these so far. This has been my final one. I'm sorry it's taken so long to get to this final one, but Christmas happened, New Year's happened, a lot of things happened. What are you going to do? So we're here now, and that's what's important. And so here's what Bart says about this star. He goes, this is not, referring to the narratives in Matthew and Luke, he goes, this is not a story based on historical fact. There are other kinds of implausibility in the accounts. In Matthew, for example, the wise men follow a star to Bethlehem, the star to Bethlehem, where it stops over the house where Jesus is. Then he asks, how is that star, or any celestial body, how is it that they can lead anyone to a particular town? And how can it then stop over a particular house? Well, God bless Bart Ehrman. Here's the thing. If an interpretation of a passage written by an ancient author strikes us as ridiculous or absurd, implausible, we ought to assume that it would have struck the ancient audience and the ancient author as ridiculous, absurd, and implausible. We're not smarter than ancient people. A lot of times modern folks assume that. Like, they were just all, gullible and stuff back then, but there's no indication of that. You had gullible people back then, just like you have them today, but you also had a lot of sober-minded, cynical people back then, just like you do today. So if something would strike us as absurd, we ought to assume it would strike them as absurd as well. So that ought to lead us to look for a different interpretation of the passage. In this case, it's not hard to find one. The fact of the matter is that Matthew doesn't say that the star stopped over the house where Jesus was at. He simply says that the star stopped over the place where Jesus was born. And that's a very general reference. It doesn't need to mean anything more than that the star stopped on the horizon in the direction that the Magi were to travel. I suspect that Bart's reading of the infancy narratives has been a little too influenced by these contemporary manger scenes where you have this magical star shining down like a laser beam on the baby Jesus and whatever. But the text itself doesn't have anything like that. It just says the star stopped over the place. Actually, that was, I've read, not an uncommon way for astrologers in particular to refer to celestial activity. They would say of a comet, for example, that it's hovering over a particular city. But they didn't mean that like literally, like it was 2 feet above the ground in the city or something like that. They meant something along the lines of what we mean when we say, gosh, look at that beautiful moon on top of those mountains or on the horizon or whatever. It just means in that direction. And so the story is not as ridiculous as Bart is making it out to be. This Star of Bethlehem is an interesting thing. Most people throughout history have assumed that it was a supernatural phenomenon, like the pillar of fire that led the Israelites in the wilderness. And for all of us who believe in the reality of the supernatural, that's entirely possible. I have no trouble with that. At the same time, the way Matthew presents it, it doesn't seem like there's anything supernatural about the star. The Magi say that they saw the star rising. And that indicates that it was just a normal star rising the way stars do. There's no supernatural features ascribed to this star in Matthew's narrative. It doesn't say that it was supernaturally bright or that it had a laser beam on the baby Jesus or anything like that. He speaks about it as though it was a regular star. The only thing that's distinctive about the star is the Magi say that it was his star. We saw his star rising. And so it was a star that was uniquely associated with the birth of this king in Bethlehem. And the Magi say that they got this information from this prophecy found in Micah, that a king would be born in Bethlehem. We don't know how these Magi got that information. Most people assume that they're from Persia, which is very, very much steeped in astrology. We don't know how in particular they got this information, but we do know that these ancient astrologers all over the Roman Empire, because astrology was just popular everywhere, but they were very eclectic. They gathered sources. I mean, they mined ancient holy books looking for secret wisdom and hidden prophecies and stuff all over the place, from Egypt and wherever. So it's not surprising that they would have and be studying this holy book of the Jews. More than that we can't say, but they had this prophecy, and that's what led them here. Now, there's been a number of theories proposed as to what this Star of Bethlehem really is, and I'll be honest with you, This is not a topic that's really grabbed my interest very much, so I haven't studied this in depth at all. There was, however, one book I came in contact with several years ago. It's by Michael Molnar, and it's called The Star of Bethlehem, The Legacy of the Magi. And the only reason this book caught my attention is that it was published by Rutgers Publishing House, which is a real reputable academic publishing house. It struck me that they would publish this book. Plus, it was endorsed by this astronomer at Harvard. And so it caught my attention, and I gave it a quick reading. I'd like to just kind of share, as best as I can remember, his theory, because it struck me as more plausible than I thought it would be. It's a little bit detailed here, but I think it'll be worth paying some attention to. To understand this theory, you have to know what a lunar occultation is. A lunar occultation is when the moon eclipses a star or a planet. Lunar occultation. And because the trajectory of stars and the rotation of the Earth and such, they're invariant, astronomers can now predict with great precision when these occultations happened in the past and when they'll happen in the future. So here's Molnar's theory. He believes that the Star of Bethlehem was a lunar occultation of Jupiter that happened twice in 6 BC. The first time it happened, it would have been in the eastern part of the sky in the constellation Aries. And that would explain why Matthew refers to this star that arose in the east. That happened on April 17th in 6 BC. And the second time, Jupiter would have been going through what astronomers call this retrograde motion. And that happens when the particular rotation of the Earth aligned with a particular star makes it look like the star stops in the sky and even drifts backwards a little bit. It appears that way. And that would explain why Matthew says that the star stopped in the sky over the place where Jesus was born. They were to head in that direction. So that's a possible theory. It's got some interesting correlations. But what is fascinating about Molnar's book is that he then gives 4 pieces of evidence that he argues confirms this identification of the Star of Bethlehem. First, he gives a lot of evidence that Jupiter was widely regarded as the regal star in the ancient world. It was a star that was associated with the birth of kings, especially when it appeared in close proximity with the moon. All right? Remember that. Second thing is he amasses a lot of evidence to show that Aries, which is represented as a ram in the zodiac, that was widely associated with the kingdom of Judea. All right? The third thing, and here's where it starts to get kind of interesting, is that his research led him to, he discovered this coin in Syria that was minted around the mid-4th century, which would be right after Constantine's conversion. And what's unique about this coin is this. In most ancient coins, they would have the profile of the king, of Caesar, stamped on it. But this curious coin has stamped on it Aries with a star above it. It has the ram with a star above it, which is kind of interesting. So Molnar argues that this indicates that whoever minted this coin was paying homage to a king who's associated with a star in the constellation Aries. And given that Constantine had just converted and Rome was in the process of becoming a quote-unquote Christian empire, he argues that the coin was paying homage to Christ, the king who came out of Judea, whose birth was associated with a star in the constellation of Aries. Kind of interesting. Then the fourth piece of evidence, and this is, I think, the most impressive, is that he uncovered this book written by an ancient astronomer named Firmicus Maternus. Firmicus Maternus. The book was written in 334, which is right around the time that this coin was minted. And Maternus was this pagan astrologer who had converted to Christianity. And in this book he says that the birth of the immortal and omnipotent king was signified by the eclipse of Jupiter by the moon in the constellation Aries. So you pull all this together, Jupiter being the regal star, Aries being the ram that was associated with the king of Judea, this coin with Aries on it, and this book. And putting it all together, Molnar concludes that as Rome was in the process of becoming quote-unquote Christian, that the identification of the Star of Bethlehem with this lunar eclipse of Jupiter in the constellation Aries was a fairly well-known fact. And we know that it happened twice in 6 BC. That's a pretty interesting theory. Now, you might ask the question, Why doesn't Maternus just state that Jesus was the king he was talking about? Why not make it explicit? And Molnar's response to that is this. He argues that astrology was, as everyone knows, very popular throughout the Roman Empire. Everyone dabbled in it. But Christians were very much opposed to it, partly because it was associated with fate, and Christians were real defenders. The early Christians were, pre-Augustinian Christians were great defenders of free will, didn't want to have anything to do with fate. And also because it was associated with divination, which it is, and Christians were opposed to all sorts of divination. So because Maternus was a recent convert to Christianity, Molnar argues that he didn't want to appear to endorse astrology by explicitly associating the birth of Jesus with the movement of stars. But at the same time, he wanted to pass on this true historical information, and so he made his reference to this king opaque and indirect. But Molnar argues that most people at the time would have gotten the reference for the same reason that most people of the time would have understood that that coin was referring to Jesus. It's also why Molnar argues that this identification of the Star of Bethlehem with this lunar eclipse of Jupiter, why this was eventually forgotten in the church history. It was just too embarrassing for the church to pass on. It's interesting when you read some of the early accounts of the early fathers of dealing with the Magi, you can tell they just struggle with this. They didn't know what to do with these Magi. They're opposed to astrology, and yet here, of all the people God could invite to celebrate the birth of Jesus, he invites these astrologers, these pagan astrologers. It's really a kind of an interesting thing to think about. And so it looks like it's endorsing astrology, and so the early fathers wrestled with it. The church was never comfortable with that, has never been comfortable with it. In fact, even as I'm sharing this, it feels weird to me to be talking about the constellation Aries and the Ram and the Zodiac and whatever, but, there you go. It's in the scripture. And so it was forgotten. But Molnar feels like he has uncovered this long forgotten piece of information. There you go. That's his theory on the Star of Bethlehem. What do you think? It's at least it's the most plausible thing that I found. Not that I've looked very hard, but I thought it was worth passing on. So what hangs on this? Absolutely nothing. Nothing. Except this. That if this is true, if you accept Molnar's account, then it's one more piece of confirmation that the gospel infancy narratives are anchored in history. It's one more piece of evidence that the gospels are generally reliable. And it's one more piece of evidence that Bart Ehrman, God bless him, that he's mistaken in thinking that these accounts are substantially legendary. So think about it. God bless you. Stay tuned and always live in love as Christ loved you and gave his life for you. God bless.